Today we're talking about something many men quietly struggle with but rarely understand. What not to do when a woman starts losing interest, and how the wrong reaction is often the very thing that makes her pull away for good. This isn't about tricks, pressure, or chasing harder. It's about understanding the emotional mistake that turns temporary distance into permanent disconnection. Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever felt that sudden shift, text slowing down, warmth fading, effort feeling one-sided, this conversation is for you. And I want to say this up front. Losing someone's interest does not automatically mean you did something wrong, but how you respond in that moment often determines whether attraction has a chance to return or whether it disappears completely. I'm speaking to you not as a dating coach, but as a therapist who has sat across from men in private rooms, listening to the same pain expressed in different ways. Because of confidentiality, I'll never name anyone, but the patterns are consistent. Men don't usually lose women because they stop being attractive. They lose them because fear takes over and fear changes their behavior. Here's the uncomfortable part most people don't want to hear. The moment you feel her pulling away, your instincts will push you to do exactly what guarantees she won't come back. You'll want to explain, fix, chase, prove, or over-communicate. It feels logical. It feels caring. And yet, emotionally, it often does the opposite of what you intend. In therapy, I've watched men replay these moments over and over, realizing too late that they responded from anxiety instead of grounded confidence. Not because they were weak, but because no one ever taught them what attraction actually responds to during emotional distance. This video isn't about blaming you or telling you to act cold. It's about awareness. When you understand what silently turns attraction off, you gain the power to stop sabotaging yourself, and in many cases, to rebuild interest naturally, without forcing anything. Stay with me. What you're about to hear may challenge what you've been told, but it might also explain why nothing you tried before seemed to work. 1. Panicking. When distance appears. When a woman starts pulling away, the first thing that usually shows up isn't logic, it's panic. I've seen this repeatedly in my work as a therapist. A man notices a change in tone, less enthusiasm, shorter responses, or emotional distance, and something inside him tightens. His mind begins racing, filling the silence with imagined meanings. He starts scanning his past actions, replaying conversations, searching for the exact moment things went wrong. This internal panic is subtle at first, but it quickly leaks into behavior. What most men don't realize is that panic has a presence. You don't have to say you're afraid for it to be felt. It shows up in how quickly you respond, how intensely you ask questions, how often you seek reassurance, and how much emotional weight you place on her reactions. In therapy sessions, men often tell me, "I was just trying to fix things." But emotionally, what they were communicating was urgency, and urgency rarely feels attractive. It feels heavy, it feels pressured, it feels like responsibility. I remember sitting with a client who genuinely believed that showing more care, more attention, and more availability would calm the situation. From his perspective, he was being mature and communicative. From her emotional experience, though, the sudden increase in effort felt like something was being demanded of her. Clarity, reassurance, certainty, before she was ready to give it. That gap between intention and impact is where attraction quietly collapses. Panic also changes how men relate to themselves. Instead of staying grounded, they begin outsourcing their emotional stability. Her mood becomes the measuring stick for their self-worth. A warm reply brings relief. Distance brings anxiety. Over time, this creates an unspoken dynamic where she becomes the emotional regulator, and that shift alone can drain attraction faster than any argument ever could. The controversial truth here is this: attraction doesn't usually disappear because of one mistake. It fades when emotional safety is replaced with emotional pressure. Panic accelerates that process, not because it's wrong to care, but because caring without emotional steadiness turns into clinging, even when it's subtle and well-intentioned. As a therapist, I've watched men learn this the hard way. The moment they stopped reacting to fear and started responding from calm self-respect, the entire dynamic changed. Not always instantly, and not always with the same outcome, but with dignity, clarity, and emotional balance restored. When distance appears, panic feels natural, but acting from it is the one thing that almost guarantees further disconnection. The work isn't to suppress emotion, it's to regulate it, because the way you handle that first wave of fear often decides whether attraction has space to return or whether it feels smothered beyond repair. 2. Trying to talk attraction back. One of the most common mistakes I see when a woman's interest begins to fade is the attempt to talk attraction back into existence. On the surface, it sounds reasonable. If something feels off, why not discuss it? Why not clarify intentions, express feelings, and create understanding? That logic works well in many areas of life. Emotionally, though, attraction doesn't respond to explanation the way problems at work or misunderstandings between friends do. In therapy sessions, men often describe long conversations they initiated at exactly the wrong time. They'll say things like, "I just wanted to know where her head was," or "I wanted us to be on the same page." What they don't realize is that when attraction is slipping, conversations driven by uncertainty don't feel grounding. They feel interrogative, even when spoken gently. Not because the questions are aggressive, but because they demand emotional clarity from someone who hasn't found it yet. I remember a client who believed that being emotionally open would solve everything. He carefully explained how much he valued the connection, how serious his intentions were, and how willing he was to work through anything together. Intellectually, nothing he said was wrong. Emotionally, though, the conversation landed as pressure. Instead of creating closeness, it made her feel like she had to either reassure him or disappoint him, and neither option allowed attraction to breathe. This is where many men get confused. They assume silence means disinterest, and conversation means connection. In reality, attraction often operates beneath words. When you try to reason with a feeling that hasn't fully formed or has already begun shifting, you unintentionally spotlight the imbalance. You're communicating without meaning to that you need an answer now to feel okay. That need is felt more than it is heard. Another pattern I see is men oversharing their internal process. They narrate their anxiety, their confusion, their desire for certainty, hoping vulnerability will bring her closer. Vulnerability is powerful when it's grounded. When it's fueled by fear, it subtly asks the other person to stabilize you. That emotional transfer can feel overwhelming, especially to someone already pulling back. The educational part here is understanding timing. Healthy communication doesn't disappear when attraction fades. It simply changes form. Sometimes the most emotionally intelligent response isn't to explain or clarify, but to regulate yourself, observe the dynamic, and allow space for her emotional experience without trying to manage it. Talking doesn't rebuild attraction when the conversation is driven by insecurity. Presence does, emotional steadiness does, and paradoxically, when men stop trying to talk feelings into alignment, they often create the very safety and calm that makes genuine connection possible again. 3. Over-explaining your intentions. Over-explaining your intentions is one of the quietest ways men sabotage attraction, especially when a woman's interest begins to fade. It rarely looks dramatic. In fact, it often looks responsible, honest, even emotionally mature on the surface. But beneath it, there's usually fear. Fear of being misunderstood, replaced, or forgotten. And fear has a way of turning clarity into pressure. In my work as a therapist, I've watched men slowly talk themselves out of connection without realizing it. A woman becomes slightly distant, and the man responds by explaining more. He clarifies how serious he is, he reassures her about his loyalty, he outlines his plans, values, and intentions in detail, hoping that certainty will restore what feels unstable. What he doesn't see is that attraction doesn't grow from being convinced, it grows from feeling. One client once told me, "I just wanted her to know I wasn't wasting her time." That sounds reasonable, but emotionally, his repeated explanations landed as a request for validation. Each explanation carried the unspoken message: "Please see me the way I need to be seen so I can feel secure again." Over time, that dynamic shifted the emotional weight onto her. Instead of curiosity and desire, she felt responsibility. Over-explaining also removes mystery. And mystery isn't about playing games. It's about allowing space for emotional discovery. When you spell everything out too soon, especially during moments of uncertainty, you eliminate the natural tension that fuels attraction. You leave no room for her to wonder, reflect, or feel into her own experience. Everything becomes defined, structured, and heavy. There's another layer men often miss. When you over-explain, you're often arguing against a feeling that hasn't been spoken out loud. You sense hesitation, so you preemptively defend yourself. You clarify intentions she hasn't questioned. You reassure against fears she hasn't expressed. Emotionally, this can feel invasive, as though her internal process is being rushed or overridden. From a therapeutic perspective, this behavior usually comes from a good place. Men want to be understood. They want to be chosen consciously, not accidentally. But attraction doesn't respond well to being managed. The more you try to control how you're perceived, the less authentic the connection feels. Engagement returns when men learn to tolerate uncertainty without filling it with words, when they stop explaining themselves and start embodying emotional steadiness, when their actions align quietly without needing constant verbal confirmation. The controversial truth is this: the man who can stay grounded without over-explaining sends a powerful emotional signal, not indifference, but self-trust. And self-trust is far more compelling than any carefully worded explanation could ever be. 4. Chasing for emotional reassurance. Chasing for emotional reassurance doesn't only happen in new or uncertain connections. In fact, I see it just as often, sometimes even more, in established relationships. When a woman in a relationship begins to feel distant, many men assume the rules change because there's history, commitment, or a shared routine. They believe that chasing is justified now, that asking for reassurance is reasonable because she's already theirs. Emotionally, though, attraction doesn't recognize ownership. It responds to dynamics. I've worked with men who were years into relationships and still found themselves spiraling when their partner became quieter or less expressive. One man described how he started checking in constantly, asking if everything was okay, if she was upset, if he'd done something wrong. Each question was meant to repair connection. Over time, though, the relationship began to feel emotionally crowded. His need for reassurance became a daily presence, and her space slowly disappeared. In relationships, chasing often disguises itself as concern. It sounds like care, it looks like effort, but when reassurance becomes a requirement rather than a gift, the emotional tone shifts. The woman no longer feels chosen. She feels responsible. Instead of relating as two grounded individuals, the dynamic becomes one of emotional pursuit and emotional withdrawal. One of the most difficult moments in therapy is helping a man see that his reassurance seeking isn't about love. It's about anxiety. Anxiety about losing the bond, about not being enough, about change. When that anxiety isn't managed internally, it gets placed on the relationship. The partner is expected to calm it, soothe it, and resolve it. Over time, that emotional labor can quietly erode attraction. What makes this especially painful in relationships is the sense of confusion. Men will say, "We used to be close. I don't understand why trying harder is making things worse." The answer lies in emotional polarity. Attraction needs room to move. When one person leans in too heavily, the other often leans back. Not out of cruelty, but out of instinct to rebalance. I've seen relationships begin to heal when men learn to pause the chase, not by withdrawing affection, but by reclaiming emotional stability. They stopped needing constant reassurance and started offering presence without demand. They focused on their own grounding rather than monitoring her emotional state. In long-term connections, love doesn't disappear overnight, but attraction can dull when reassurance replaces confidence. The paradox is that when men stop chasing emotional certainty, they often create the very safety that allows closeness and attraction to return naturally. 5. Losing your emotional center. Losing your emotional center is one of the most damaging shifts that can happen inside a relationship, and it often occurs so gradually that men don't notice it until attraction has already changed. When a woman in a relationship begins to pull back, many men stop orienting around their own internal stability and start orienting around her moods, reactions, and approval. What begins as attentiveness slowly turns into self-abandonment. In therapy, I've sat with men who once described describe themselves as calm, decisive, and grounded, only to realize that over time, their emotional state had become entirely dependent on their partner's responses. A good day in the relationship meant they felt confident and secure. A distant day meant anxiety, self-doubt, and overthinking. Without realizing it, they had handed over their emotional center. One man in a long-term relationship shared how he stopped trusting his own instincts. If he felt something was off, he didn't pause to reflect. He immediately looked to his partner for confirmation. If she seemed disengaged, he assumed he was at fault. If she was quiet, he filled the silence with worry. His inner compass no longer guided him. Her emotional signals did. Attraction doesn't disappear because of one argument. It fades when one person no longer feels emotionally anchored within themselves. From a relational psychology perspective, emotional centering is about self-regulation. When a man can hold his emotions without rushing to resolve them through his partner, he creates safety. When he can tolerate discomfort without collapsing or controlling, he becomes emotionally reliable. Losing that center, however, creates instability. The relationship begins to feel unpredictable, not because of conflict, but because emotional gravity has shifted. Women in relationships often describe this shift indirectly. They'll say things like, "I feel like I have to be careful how I act," or "I can't just have a bad day without it becoming a big conversation." That's the cost of losing emotional center. The relationship becomes emotionally reactive instead of emotionally grounded. I've seen powerful changes when men learn to re-anchor themselves. They stop tracking every emotional fluctuation. They return to their own routines, values, and internal sense of calm. Not as punishment, not as withdrawal, but as restoration. When a man regains his emotional center, the relationship often feels lighter again. Attraction in long-term relationships thrives on stability, not control. When you stay rooted in yourself, you offer presence without pressure. And that grounded presence, more than reassurance or effort, is what allows intimacy and attraction to breathe again. 6. Making her the emotional authority. Making her the emotional authority is one of the most invisible shifts that happens when a man feels he's losing ground in attraction. It doesn't start as submission. It starts as accommodation. He listens more, adapts more, adjusts more, until one day, without realizing it, his emotional reality begins to orbit around hers. In therapy, I've had men describe this dynamic without using those words. They'll say things like, "I just wait to see what mood she's in before I speak," or, "If she seems off, I automatically assume I did something wrong." That's the moment emotional authority has quietly transferred. Her internal state becomes the reference point for how he thinks, feels, and acts. What makes this so damaging is that it slowly erodes self-trust. The man stops asking, "What do I feel?" and starts asking, "How will this make her feel?" Every decision becomes filtered through her emotional response. Over time, this creates a power imbalance, not because she demands it, but because he hands it over. Attraction struggles in this environment because polarity disappears. When one person becomes the emotional compass, the other loses grounding. The relationship stops feeling dynamic and starts feeling managed. Women often describe this experience as feeling emotionally crowded or burdened, even if they can't explain why. They don't feel met. They feel monitored. I remember a man in a long-term relationship who couldn't remember the last time he expressed an opinion without bracing for her reaction. He wasn't afraid of conflict. He was afraid of destabilizing the emotional atmosphere. So he shrank. And as he shrank, she felt less drawn, not because she wanted control, but because she no longer felt a steady emotional presence beside her. From a therapeutic lens, emotional authority should always remain internal. Each person is responsible for their own regulation. When a man tries to manage her emotions, he also communicates something unspoken, that he doesn't trust her ability to handle discomfort, and that he doesn't trust himself to remain steady if she doesn't. The turning point comes when a man reclaims emotional self-leadership, not by being dismissive or rigid, but by staying rooted. He allows her emotions to exist without absorbing them. He responds thoughtfully instead of reflexively. He stops negotiating his inner world for approval. This shift is powerful because it restores balance. When emotional authority returns to where it belongs, within each individual, attraction has room to re-emerge. Calm confidence doesn't demand attention, it simply exists, and often that presence is what was missing all along. 7. Forcing connection instead of allowing space. Forcing connection instead of allowing space is one of the most misunderstood reactions men have when they sense a woman pulling away. It feels counterintuitive to step back when closeness is fading. So many men do the opposite. They increase contact, initiate deeper conversations, plan more time together, and push for emotional closeness, believing that effort will restore what feels fragile. Emotionally, though, forced connection rarely creates safety. It creates resistance. In therapy, I often hear men say, "If I don't try, won't I lose her?" That fear is real, and it makes sense. But what they don't realize is that space is not abandonment. Space is where emotions reorganize. When someone feels unsure, pressured closeness can feel invasive, even if it's loving in intent. The more connection is pushed, the less authentic it feels. I remember working with a man in a long-term relationship who noticed his partner becoming quieter and less affectionate. Instead of slowing down, he doubled his efforts. He planned conversations late at night, checked in frequently during the day, and tried to fix the emotional distance through presence. Over time, she became more withdrawn, not because she didn't care, but because she no longer had room to feel on her own terms. Forced connection often removes choice. When closeness is constant and emotionally loaded, the woman doesn't get to miss you, reflect, or move toward you naturally. Attraction thrives on voluntary engagement. When connection becomes a requirement, it loses its vitality. What once felt warm starts to feel heavy. From a therapeutic perspective, allowing space is an act of emotional maturity. It says, "I trust myself and I trust you." It allows both people to regulate independently rather than merging anxieties. Men who struggle with this often equate space with rejection, but space handled calmly actually communicates security. The men I've seen make the most progress are the ones who stop trying to orchestrate connection. They remain available but not intrusive. They stay warm without chasing. They focus on their own grounding, work, purpose, routine, without disappearing emotionally. This balance is difficult, but powerful. When space is allowed rather than resisted, something interesting happens. The emotional atmosphere softens. Pressure lifts. The woman has room to feel curiosity again rather than obligation. And whether the connection returns or not, the man regains his dignity and emotional stability. The deeper lesson here is that connection can't be forced into existence. It emerges when both people feel free. And paradoxically, when men stop pushing for closeness, they often create the conditions that make real connection and attraction possible again. Attraction isn't about chasing, explaining, or forcing connection. It's about presence, emotional steadiness, and respect for boundaries. When a woman begins to pull away, panic, over-explaining, seeking reassurance, or surrendering your emotional power only accelerates disconnection. The men I've worked with who rebuild interest do it by reclaiming their emotional center, maintaining self-leadership, and allowing space for her to feel without pressure. True influence comes quietly, through confidence and grounded presence, not words or effort. When you focus on yourself first, you create the conditions for attraction to return naturally, on her terms, without compromising your dignity.